Heracles is the Greek hero most closely tied to strength, but his story is also one of suffering, service, and repeated loss. In the oldest surviving traditions, he is shaped by both divine birth and human consequence. His father is Zeus, his mother, the mortal Alcmene, and later Greek poets turned his life into a long sequence of labors and setbacks. The clearest ancient account comes from Homeric references, early epic tradition, and, much later, mythographers such as Apollodorus and Diodorus Siculus. Those sources do not always agree, but they preserve the same broad pattern. Heracles is born into danger, driven to terrible deeds, and then made to answer for them through service. His life became one of the Greek world's main ways of thinking about both favor and punishment from the gods. Heracles enters Greek tradition through a birth already entangled with divine rivalry. His mother is Alcmene, his father Zeus, but the story is never just a simple account of a god fathering a child. In the surviving sources, Zeus' intrusion into Alcmene's household creates tension in the heroic order. Heracles is born into the house of Perseus, within a line that already carries weight in Greek myth, so his life matters before he has done anything at all. The basic shape of the conception is familiar from later mythographers, though earlier poetry only hints at it. Zeus approaches Alcmene while her husband Amphitryon is away, and the child that follows is understood as Zeus's son. In some versions, Zeus prolongs the night so his visit can last longer than a mortal night should, a detail that later writers enjoyed because it makes the deception feel deliberate. Other traditions focus less on the trick and more on the larger fact of mixed parentage. Heracles is mortal in body, but tied to Olympian power through Zeus. That combination explains both his extraordinary strength and the instability that follows him. The setting matters as well. Alcmene and Amphitryon belong to a royal house in Tiryns or nearby Mycenaean tradition, depending on the version, and Greek myth often places Heracles within the wider heroic world of that age. His descent through Perseus links him to the great families of Argos and its orbit, where kingship, inheritance, and legitimacy are recurring concerns. The birth is therefore not only about a god and a woman, it is also about succession, household boundaries, and the way myth uses family lines to explain why certain figures matter before they have acted. Hera's hostility begins here, not later. She is not merely angry in the abstract. Zeus's son by another woman threatens the balance of his household and, in mythic terms, her dignity as queen of the gods. Ancient traditions often treat Hera's opposition to Heracles as one of the defining pressures on his life. The most famous consequences come later, in the madness that drives him toward disaster and in the obstacles that shape the labors. But the resentment is already present at birth. In some versions, Hera works against the child before he can even be named. In others, her opposition remains implied in the way his story keeps turning from promise toward hardship. The naming itself also varies. Heracles is usually explained as meaning something like the glory of Hera, which has long struck readers as ironic given her hostility toward him. Ancient authors were aware of that tension and sometimes used it to suggest that the hero's fame is tied to surviving the enmity of the goddess whose name he bears. There are alternative explanations in later tradition, and ancient etymology often followed symbolic logic rather than strict linguistics. What matters in the myth is that the name already contains contradiction. He carries a title linked to the goddess who opposes him, and that irony becomes part of the story Greeks told about endurance. Other names appear in some traditions as well. He is also called Alcides, in connection with his grandfather Alceos or Alceos, depending on the source and family line being emphasized. That older name keeps him tied to his mortal ancestry before the fame of Heracles becomes dominant. The coexistence of these names is typical of Greek myth, where a hero can belong to several traditions at once, each preserving a different emphasis. One name points to family descent, another to public destiny, and the later heroic identity gathers both into a single figure. The earliest hostility is sometimes described through omens rather than direct attack. Ancient writers like to attach prophecy to the birth of great men, and Heracles is no exception. His coming is often placed inside a sequence of divine expectations that make him seem less like an isolated individual and more like a figure already claimed by larger powers. Homer and Hesiod preserve only fragments, while later epic summaries and mythological handbooks fill in the family narrative more fully. Still, they share the same core idea. The son of Zeus is born under pressure, and the pressure comes in part from the household of the gods themselves. That matters because Greek myth rarely treats divine parentage as pure privilege. It is often a cause of danger. A child born from Zeus may receive power, but that power arrives with conflict attached. Heracles is the clearest case of that pattern. From the beginning, his life is marked by the fact that he belongs to two worlds at once. If Heracles is the son of Zeus and Alcmene, the next question is why that birth matters beyond family scandal. In the tradition, he belongs to the house of Perseus, and that lineage gives his story a political shape. He is not just a strong man from Thebes. He is tied to one of the major heroic families of Greek myth, a family that claims descent from a divine ancestor and produces rulers, brides, exiles, and rival claimants across several generations. Later Greek writers use that house to explain how Heracles can move between cities and kingdoms with such force. He is part of a line already marked by ambition and disruption. The family background begins with Amphitryon and Alcmene. Alcmene is usually described as a daughter of Electryon, one of Perseus' descendants. Amphitryon belongs to the same heroic network, though the details differ from source to source. In the usual Theban version, Amphitryon has fled his homeland after an accidental killing and is living away from Mycenaean power struggles when Zeus takes the form of the absent husband and lies with Alcmene. That setting matters because it places Heracles' birth inside a household already shaped by violence, exile, and questions of legitimate succession. The family is not stable before the child is born. It is already under strain. There is also a political side to this background. Heracles is linked to the old royal line of Tyrrhens and Mycenae through Perseus, and later traditions use that connection to explain both his status and his tensions with kings. He stands close to monarchy without being securely inside it. In some tellings, the house of Perseus has been favored and burdened by prophecy for generations. In others, the emphasis falls less on a single oracle and more on the general pattern that greatness in this family always brings rivalry. Greek myth often treats noble houses as places where inheritance is never simple. A child does not only receive wealth or rank, he receives obligations, enemies, and the unfinished business of earlier generations. The most famous prophetic thread attached to Heracles' family comes from the story of a son of Zeus who is destined to rule among the descendants of Perseus. The exact wording and sequence vary. Later authors, especially in mythographical summaries, connect that prediction to the rivalry between Heracles and Eurystheus. Eurystheus is also a descendant of Perseus, and the two men are set against one another, not because they are unrelated, but because they are too closely related within the same heroic house. In one version of the tradition, Hera speeds Eurystheus' birth and delays Heracles so that the prophecy is fulfilled in the wrong hands. That detail appears most clearly in later literary forms, where divine intervention explains why the weaker claimant gains the throne and the stronger one must serve him. The story turns lineage into irony. The child meant for greatness is born into a family structure that can be manipulated against him. Thebes is the local setting most often associated with Heracles' early life, but the myth does not stay confined to one city. The older heroic world stretches between Thebes, Tyrrhens, Argos, and other places that preserve their own version of the family. That is one reason the sources can seem uneven. A Theban tradition will emphasize Alcmene, Amphitryon, and the child's upbringing in Thebes. A Peloponnesian tradition may focus more on the house of Perseus and the claims of Mycenae. Later writers often try to join these strands into one continuous family tree, but the older evidence suggests a more flexible and regional myth. Heracles belongs to the broad Greek heroic past, and different communities attached him to themselves in different ways. Even in the surviving poems, he appears as a figure whose life is already public before his own actions begin. Homer mentions him in passing as a heroic presence known across generations. Hesiod gives him a place in the divine and heroic family order. Later sources add the domestic details: the mother, the stepfather, the rival king, the prophetic warning, the household of Perseus. The result is not a tidy origin story, but a web. Heracles is born into inherited expectation, and expectation in Greek myth is often another form of pressure. It can promise honor, but it can also attract resentment from gods and mortals alike. That is why his childhood cannot be understood as a private beginning. The boy enters a world where names already carry claims. Alcmene's line ties him to the old heroic house. Zeus's paternity gives him an exceptional place in the mythic order. Hera's hostility turns that exceptional place into danger. Heracles' first great test comes before he can speak. In the best-known version, Hera sends 2 serpents into the cradle to kill him and his brother Iphicles while they are still infants in Thebes. The myth is plain about the stakes. If Zeus has fathered a child outside Hera's control, that child must be stopped before prophecy and expectation can unfold. The story is not only about danger, it is about recognition. A god's hostility marks the child as important, and the household learns that this birth is not ordinary. The episode survives in more than one form, but the central image stays the same. Snakes enter the infant's space, and the child answers with strength far beyond his age. In some versions, Iphicles reacts like a helpless baby while Heracles grasps the serpents and strangles them with his hands. That is the detail ancient art and literature remembered. It does not simply prove that he is strong. It shows that his strength appears before training, before fame, and before any heroic labor that might explain it. He does not become extraordinary through achievement. He reveals himself as extraordinary in the cradle. Ancient writers did not preserve the scene in exactly the same way. Some place it while Amphitryon and Alcmene are asleep. Others make attendants or other family members witnesses to the miracle. Later mythographers also differ on whether Hera sent the snakes directly or through a broader divine plot. The details change, but the narrative function does not. Heracles is attacked at his most vulnerable and survives by acting with the force of a grown hero. The whole life is compressed into a single childhood scene: danger, resistance, and the first sign that ordinary limits do not hold for him. This is why the episode matters so much in the larger tradition. Greek myth often signals future greatness through early signs. A child who survives exposure outwits a threat or shows unusual strength is being introduced as someone set apart. Heracles' snake episode does that with unusual clarity. It tells the audience that the boy belongs to the mortal world, since he is still in a cradle and still dependent on others, but it also tells them that he will not remain within mortal measure. The force that saves him is too direct and too great. It is the kind of strength that will later break beasts, clear roads, and endure suffering beyond ordinary endurance. There is also a quieter meaning in the story. The serpents are not just random monsters. In Greek myth, snakes can suggest danger, household space, earth powers, and divine warning at once. Here they become instruments of Hera's resentment, but they also suit a hero whose life keeps crossing between the home and larger sacred forces. The attack happens inside the household, yet it is already a conflict of gods. That pattern will repeat. Heracles' story keeps drawing public myth into private life, and private life into public ruin. Later storytellers like to emphasize the omen-like character of the scene. The infant's victory becomes the first visible proof that he is not simply a prince of Thebes or the son of a famous father. He is a figure judged in advance by divine powers, and who will spend much of his career surviving that judgment. The cradle, in that sense, is the first battlefield. Before he knows his name, before he learns skill or restraint, Heracles is already meeting the kind of adversary that will define his legend, a force larger than himself, sent from above, met with bare hands. The household would have understood the event as warning as much as marvel. If the child could repel a deadly threat while still an infant, then his future was already moving beyond ordinary expectations attached to birth and upbringing. In some later retellings, the scene helps explain why Heracles was seen as different from the beginning, even among those who raised him. That difference mattered in a culture where signs at birth, unusual childhood acts, and divine interventions were often read together. A life could be marked early, long before the adult deeds that later made it famous. By the end of the story, the child can no longer seem merely promising. He has already shown that he can meet death and prevail. That does not remove the danger around him. After the first danger had passed, the next question was not whether Heracles was strong, but what kind of life such a child could be given. Greek myth often treats education as a test of character, as much as a matter of instruction, and that is especially true here. In the surviving stories, Heracles was not left to grow wild. He was taught, as a prince should be, the skills expected of a free and noble man: music, wrestling, archery, riding, and chariot driving. The traditions differ on who taught him what, but the pattern is consistent. He was meant to become not only powerful, but civilized, and the myths keep returning to the tension between those two things. In some accounts, Amphitryon, the mortal husband of Alcmene, arranged for leading teachers to instruct the boy. The choice of subjects matters. Music was not a decorative extra in Greek culture. It belonged to education, discipline, and self-command. A young aristocrat was expected to learn not only how to fight, but how to listen, measure himself, and take part in the social life of the household and the city. Wrestling and archery trained the body in different ways, one through close struggle and balance, the other through distance, precision, and control. Chariot driving added another layer, since it required timing and nerve as much as strength. Heracles is already being shaped as a figure who can dominate physical contests, but the tradition also shows that he was supposed to be guided into order. That he often failed to remain within it is part of the larger story. Several teachers appear in later mythic tradition, though the names and details vary from source to source. The important point is not a fixed classroom roster, but the recurring picture of a youth whose body develops faster than his temper. Some versions name a music teacher called Linus, others connect him to different figures for different skills, because ancient myth did not preserve one official biography. It preserved episodes that could be attached to a hero who was already famous. The result is a childhood told through fragments, each one showing a different side of him. The setting may shift from one poet to another, and the emphasis may change, but the underlying pattern remains the same. The boy is not only exceptional, he is difficult to manage. The story of Linus is one of the clearest examples. In some traditions, Linus taught Heracles the lyre or the rules of song, and the boy proved difficult, impatient, or unwilling to accept correction. The details are not stable across all ancient sources. What stays constant is the outcome. Heracles either struck Linus in anger or in an uncontrolled moment, and Linus died. Later writers use this episode to define his character early. It is not only that he was strong, it is that his strength came with volatility, and that volatility could turn lethal even in a setting meant to refine him. In mythic terms, the classroom becomes an early test of restraint, and Heracles fails it in a way that is impossible to ignore. That episode appears in different forms. Some tell it as a direct act of violence after punishment or criticism. Others soften or complicate the cause. The ancient mythographers were comfortable leaving that uncertainty in place. What matters for the larger narrative is that the boy cannot yet master himself. He may be brilliant in physical contests, but he is still being tested by rules, teachers, and limits that he does not naturally accept. The same figure who can overpower snakes in the cradle can also fail at the quiet discipline of education. Greek myth often treats that as a mark of heroic excess. Greatness and danger belong to the same person, and the same qualities that make him formidable can also make him ruinous in a moment. His training in wrestling and combat is easier to place within the heroic world, because those were skills that later defined his public career. Heracles is said to have excelled at strength-based contests, and many later stories make him already unmatched among youths. He could overwhelm peers, animals, and obstacles that would have stopped ordinary boys, yet even here the stories do not present simple triumph. Strength without restraint is not enough. A hero must learn when to use force and how to direct it. The traditions around his youth are therefore not just anecdotes about talent, they are early signs of a problem that will run through his whole life. He has the power to solve almost anything, but not always the judgment to do so cleanly. His archery training points to that same issue from another angle. Bow skill requires patience, aim, and a steady hand. In later heroic tradition, Heracles becomes famous for a style of action that is often blunt and overwhelming. But the educational stories remind us that he was also associated with precision. That detail matters because it shows the range of expectations around him. He was not simply a brawler. He was being formed as a complete aristocratic hero, one who could act in war, hunt, ride, and sing. The myth does not say that he lacked talent. It says that talent did not always become discipline. A well-born youth in Greek tradition was expected to master himself in public as well as in private, and Heracles stands out because he keeps exposing the gap between those expectations and his own temperament. The same is true of chariot skill. Driving a chariot in heroic myth is tied to status and warfare, but it is also a test of control over powerful forces. A horse and vehicle moving at speed can make even a strong man seem helpless if he cannot guide them properly. Heracles' association with the chariot again suggests a youth meant for command. He is being introduced to the forms of elite power, the skills a noble household would value. But the stories leave little doubt that he did not become a calm student. If anything, the more complete the education, the more clearly his temper stands out against it. The lesson is not that he lacked training. It is that training did not remove the rawness that made him so hard to contain. This is one reason the early myths of Heracles are so effective. They do not simply present him as a born powerhouse who needs no learning. They show a hero who passes through the expected social training of a Greek noble and yet remains unstable. That instability is not accidental. It prepares the audience for the rest of the story, where almost every achievement will come with strain, error, or collateral loss. Heracles can learn, he can be taught, he can even excel. But he does not become easy to live with, and the myths never let that fact disappear. In a culture that valued order, measure, and public self-command, that made him both admirable and alarming. In the broader household background, this matters because Heracles is not growing up in a vacuum. He belongs to the line of Perseus, one of the great heroic houses of Greek tradition, and that lineage gives his achievements a political and genealogical frame. His strength is not just personal, it is tied to ancestry, claim, and reputation. A descendant of Perseus is already part of a legendary map of Greek power. That is why his education matters so much in the stories. He is being prepared for a role that exceeds a single household. Even before the labors, he is being measured against the expectations of a house that carries fame and conflict in equal measure. So the youth who survives the snakes is not allowed to remain only a wonder. He is trained, corrected, and tested. He learns the arts expected of a prince, but he does so with a temper that others must constantly manage. In Greek tradition, the question is not whether Heracles is strong, it is what that strength is for and what kind of life it can justify. The myths around him often answer that question by setting two paths before him. One offers ease, safety, and immediate pleasure. The other offers labor, danger, and honor won slowly through effort. Heracles becomes the clearest example of the second path. A later moral tale, preserved most famously by Xenophon in the story of Heracles at the crossroads, makes that contrast explicit. In that account, the young hero is still deciding what sort of life to follow when two figures appear before him. One offers comfort, luxury, and short-term satisfaction. The other offers toil, discipline, and honor. This is not the oldest layer of Heracles' tradition, and it should be read as a moralized retelling rather than a simple memory of myth. But it fits a broader Greek idea very well. Greatness is rarely effortless. It is earned through restraint and endurance. That idea helps explain why Heracles mattered so much beyond his individual stories. Greek heroic culture admired physical excellence, but it also distrusted uncontrolled force. A man could be powerful and still fail badly if he lacked judgment or self-mastery. Heracles contains both sides of that problem. He is a protector, but he is also dangerous. He can save a region, and he can ruin a household. The stories do not hide that tension, they make it central. So when later authors describe him choosing the harder road, they are not adding a random moral lesson onto a separate myth. They are clarifying the logic that runs through the tradition. If Heracles is to become the greatest of Greek heroes, he cannot do it by comfort alone. He must accept difficulty as the cost of fame. In some versions, that choice is presented as a formal decision. In others, it is simply the pattern of his life. Either way, the result is the same. His story moves toward exertion, service, and suffering. That is also why the stories before the labors matter so much. They do not merely establish his strength. They show that strength without direction is not enough. The myths about his upbringing, his teachers, and his violent temper point toward a hero who will need shaping by hardship. In that sense, the choice is not only his, it is built into the tradition around him. The son of Zeus is being prepared for a life that will not allow rest. That pattern appears in the smaller deeds that come before the famous labors. Local traditions preserve him hunting dangerous animals, clearing threats from roads and settlements, and defending communities that could not defend themselves. These episodes are not always counted in a fixed sequence, and they vary from place to place, but they serve the same purpose. Heracles is already being recognized as a figure whose strength belongs in the public world. He is not only a prince with a troubled education, he is becoming a hero whose actions affect entire regions. One early example in some traditions is his conflict with cattle of Thespii, or with beasts threatening nearby land, depending on the version. Other stories place him against bandits, wolves, or regional monsters. The details change because local communities often attached his name to whatever danger they believed their own landscape had once faced. That matters. Heracles is not only a pan-Hellenic hero in the abstract, he is also a hero of many local memories. Cities and sanctuaries could claim him because his story was flexible enough to absorb their own needs. This is why the moral tradition of choosing toil over ease fits Heracles so well. The hero is already associated with work. Even before the canonical labors, his value is shown through effort. He does not win honor by inheritance alone, even if his lineage matters. He wins it by acting where others cannot. That is what Greek audiences would have recognized as properly heroic, even when they also understood how dangerous such a figure could become. The result is a character who is always being pushed toward the edge of ordinary life. He is too powerful for simple domestic peace and too important for private ambition. The stories keep setting him against tasks that exceed normal human measure. Some are practical, like clearing a road or stopping a beast. Some are moral, like proving that discipline can outrank pleasure. All of them prepare him for the larger cycle that will define his name. By the time the tradition reaches the formal labors, Heracles is no longer just a gifted youth under watchful teachers. He is a man whose life has already been shaped by conflict, judgment, and expectation. The choice of life has been made, whether in a specific philosophical story or in the broader pattern of the myths themselves. What follows will not be a quiet career. It will be a road of labor, and the fame that comes from it will always carry the memory of suffering. In some traditions, that suffering begins even before the official labors are imposed. Heracles is said to have been driven into violent acts by divine hostility, especially the anger of Hera, which makes his path less like a voluntary quest than an ordered response to catastrophe. That complicates the moral reading. The later Crossroads story presents him as a free young man selecting virtue over ease. The older mythic material is harsher. It often presents a hero whose burdens are not fully chosen but forced upon him by powers larger than himself. Greek tradition does not always separate those ideas cleanly. A man may be compelled by fate and still be judged by how he responds to what fate demands. That combination of compulsion and choice is one reason Heracles became so enduring. He could stand for endurance under pressure, but he could also stand for the effort required to master destructive impulses. Ancient audiences knew that bravery alone was not enough. A warrior who could not control himself was as dangerous to his own people as to an enemy. Heracles repeatedly occupies that unstable middle ground. He is admired for saving cities, yet his own household story is marked by disaster. He is praised as a helper of mortals, yet he is also the man most likely to become a source of fear if his anger is not checked. The myths keep returning to that tension because it is central to his heroism. Even the language of labor suits that larger pattern. In Greek, the idea of work could also imply hardship, task, or burden. Heracles becomes the hero of hard tasks because his life itself is a sequence of burdens that must be carried to completion. Later poets and vase painters could highlight different episodes, but the underlying meaning remains stable enough for audiences to recognize. He is the one who goes where others will not go, and who survives what others cannot survive. That is also why local cults were able to adopt him so widely. A figure who succeeds through effort can be connected to roads, frontiers, pastureland, mountains, and places where ordinary order breaks down. Many Greek communities seem to have remembered him as a boundary-crossing protector, someone useful at the edges of settled life. The myths of his early deeds preserve that function in miniature. Before he becomes the hero of the 12 labors, he is already acting as a defender against the things that threaten communal stability. The tradition is building a case for him, one episode at a time, so the choice of life is not a decorative episode placed beside his adventures. It is a key for reading the entire mythic cycle. Comfort is available in theory, but it does not produce Heracles, only difficulty does. Before the famous labors begin, the tradition gives Heracles a series of smaller deeds that already show the kind of hero he will become. These episodes are not arranged the same way in every source, and some belong to his youth more loosely than others, but they serve a common purpose. They present him as a figure nearby communities can rely on when ordinary men, local kings, or trained warriors cannot solve the danger before them. In some versions, he is still in Boeotia, moving through the countryside around Thebes and Tithon. There he hunts dangerous animals that threaten flocks and settlements. The point is not only that he can kill what others fear to approach, it is that he takes on the disorder of the landscape itself. In Greek myth, a hero's value is often measured by whether he can bring some safety to roads, herds, and borderlands. Heracles begins to acquire that reputation early. He is not yet famous for the 12 labors, but he is already the sort of figure people call on when a beast has become more than a beast, when it stands for a wider threat to the community. One of the best known of these early stories is his encounter with the Thespian lion, or in some traditions, the Lion of Kithaeron. The details vary, but the pattern is similar. A large and destructive lion is troubling the local people, and Heracles goes after it rather than waiting for a formal command. He kills it and, in some accounts, wears its skin. This is not yet the Nemean lion, and the distinction matters. The later Nemean episode gives him the iconic lion skin he is most often shown wearing in art. This earlier hunt works more like a rehearsal. It establishes a hero who does not merely survive danger, but moves directly into it and returns with proof of success. The setting helps explain why these stories mattered to Greek audiences. Boeotia was not just a distant backdrop, it was a region with real cities, local cults, and rival claims to prestige, and myths about Heracles were often tied to those places. A hunt in the hills above Thebes could be remembered as a local founding episode, a memory of danger pushed back and the human world made more habitable. In that sense, the story does more than praise Heracles personally. It gives a community an explanation for why its land, its roots, or its sacred places are connected to him. There are also traditions in which he clears routes or helps neighboring communities by removing local threats. Ancient myth did not always separate major heroic deeds from minor ones in the way a modern summary might. A story that explains why a road became safer or why a region linked itself to Heracles could be remembered alongside the grander cycle of labors. This is one reason his biography becomes so broad so quickly. He is a pan-Hellenic figure, but he is also a local one in many places. Different towns attached him to different dangers because that was how heroic memory worked. If a place wanted to say that order had once arrived there in person, Heracles was a natural name to use. Some later sources also place him in contests of strength against bandits or violent challengers before the formal labors are set in motion. These stories can be hard to pin down to a single early source, but they fit the larger pattern. Heracles is not a hero of distant contemplation. He becomes visible through action, Where a road is unsafe, where a beast has taken over pastureland, where an enemy thinks force is enough to rule, Heracles appears as a corrective. The myth repeatedly gives him problems that are immediate and local before it sends him into the larger, more formal tasks imposed by Eurystheus. This pattern also shows how Greek heroic tradition handled reputation. A hero did not usually begin with a formal title and then wait for destiny to appear. He accumulated it through visible service, and other people told and retold the story. Heracles is already building the public identity that will later make the labors feel like the next step, rather than a sudden change of direction. The early episodes suggest that when conflict appeared, he did not stand aside and let it become a matter for delay or ceremony. He moved toward the problem and made himself part of the answer. These early deeds matter because they explain why his later career is treated as believable within the logic of the myths. The labors do not come out of nowhere. By the time the great cycle begins, he has already shown that his strength is public, not private. People know what he can do. Communities have seen the result. His name has begun to mean more than family lineage or raw power. It means a solution to threats that sit just beyond what normal human capacity can handle. That reputation, however, is never simple praise. In Greek storytelling, the same strength that protects a city can also unsettle it. A man who can kill a lion, survive hard landscapes, and answer danger faster than ordinary rulers may save a community one day and destabilize it the next. The early myths of Heracles keep that tension alive. They let him be admired as a helper while also reminding the listener that he is too large for ordinary civic life. He is already becoming the sort of figure who belongs partly to society and partly outside it. So before the formal labors are counted, Heracles has established a clear pattern. He hunts what others cannot, clears what others avoid, and answers threats in the places where daily life is most vulnerable. That is why neighboring communities begin to know his name. Long before Eurystheus gives him a sequence of impossible tasks, Heracles has already become a protector whose strength is public and whose presence changes the balance of the world around him. Heracles does not move from fame to honor in a simple line. Even after his early deeds begin to spread, the stories return to the household, because Greek myth often tests greatness most severely in the home. In the best-known version, Heracles marries Megara, the daughter of Creon, king of Thebes. Some ancient accounts place the marriage after he has already settled into Theban life, while others treat it as part of the city's effort to give his strength a stable civic place. Either way, the marriage matters because it ties the wandering hero to family, inheritance, and rule. The Theban setting is important. Heracles is not just a solitary adventurer here, but a man whose power has already been drawn into the needs of a city. The marriage to Megara belongs to the phase of the story in which heroic force is being redirected toward ordered life. Creon's daughter gives him a place in the civic household, and with that comes the expectation that his violence will now support stability rather than disturbance. In Greek terms, marriage is not only a private bond, it is one of the ways a house continues across generations. The sources are not fully consistent about the children. Later traditions commonly give Heracles and Megara several sons, sometimes 3, though the number varies. What remains stable is the shape of the tragedy. Heracles has done what a Greek hero is supposed to do. He has defended, provided, and earned a household. But in myth, that achievement does not guarantee safety. Hera, who has opposed him from before his birth, remains the force that turns his success against him. Her hostility is tied to the long conflict over Zeus's infidelity and the insult it brings her. As Zeus's son, Heracles becomes the living reminder of that offense. In the best-known tragic tradition, Hera sends madness upon him. The earliest and most influential literary treatment is in tragedy, especially Euripides' Heracles, where the sudden violence belongs to a wider pattern of divine instability. The details differ across versions, but the outcome is the same. In Delusion, Heracles turns on the people closest to him and destroys his wife and children, the very household he should have preserved. Later retellings may change the sequence or the explanation, but they do not soften the event. The point is not that Heracles is naturally monstrous. It is that even his strength cannot protect him when the gods turn against him. This episode changes the meaning of what came before. His victories at the edges of the city had made him a public defender. Now that same power appears dangerous inside the home. Greek myth takes that shift seriously. A man of extraordinary force can clear away monsters, but if that force loses direction, it becomes ruinous in the place where protection matters most. The household is supposed to be the space of continuity, marriage, and lawful succession. Heracles instead becomes the one who breaks that continuity. What had looked like the reward for service becomes the scene of irreversible loss. Later sources disagree on how much guilt belongs to him in a moral sense. Tragedy usually emphasizes divine madness and human helplessness, making him a victim of Hera's hatred as much as an agent of the crime. Other traditions, especially those more interested in responsibility, do not remove his agency entirely. But even there, the force of madness remains essential. The ancient audience is meant to see both truths at once. Heracles commits the act, and the act is also imposed on him by a god who can bend a mortal mind. That tension is part of why the story endured. The result is exile, shame, and the collapse of household honor. The man who could withstand beasts and bandits cannot protect his own family from disaster. That is the turning point that makes the next stage of his life necessary. After the slaughter of his family, the story turns from catastrophe to ritual. In many versions, Heracles first seeks cleansing, because the pollution of blood cannot simply be ignored. Greek religion treated certain acts, especially kin-killing, as a stain that required formal purification. A hero might be strong enough to defeat a lion or wrestle a river god, but strength did not cancel ritual burden. It had to be answered through worship, instruction, and time. The issue was not only moral in the modern sense, it was also religious and civic. A man who had committed such a deed had become dangerous to the community around him until the offense was addressed in proper form. The most important sanctuary in that process is Delphi. The oracle there belongs to Apollo, a god closely tied to purification, order, and legitimate guidance. Heracles approaches Apollo's shrine because he needs more than comfort or forgiveness. He needs a command that tells him how to re-enter the human world. The surviving traditions are not perfectly consistent about the route that brings him there. Some make the consultation direct, while others place more emphasis on his seeking relief after the crime before the oracle speaks. But the outcome is stable across the main versions. Apollo gives him a path, and that path leads into service under Eurystheus. In later Greek memory, Delphi often stands at the center of moments when disorder must be answered by institution rather than impulse. Here that means the crime is not erased, but translated into a form the gods and men can recognize. That command matters because it transforms punishment into structure. Heracles does not simply wander in grief. He is assigned labor, and the labor is not his own choice. Eurystheus, the king of Tiryns and a descendant of Perseus, becomes the human instrument of that divine arrangement. This is one reason the later labors have such a strong sense of tension. They are not random adventures. They are the terms of restoration set by a god and carried out under a king who is both ruler and rival. Heracles must submit to a man beneath him in fame, but above him in political position. The humiliation is part of the cure. The arrangement also fits an older pattern in Greek myth, where a powerful figure is brought back into order through service to a lawful house. The task is personal, but it is also social. It marks the hero as someone who must now act under rule rather than outside it. Ancient traditions differ on the exact wording and even the exact cause of this service. In some accounts, the oracle tells Heracles to go to Tiryns and perform 12 tasks for Eurystheus. In others, the number and sequence are not yet fixed when the command is first given, and the familiar list crystallizes only later in literary tradition. There are also versions that tie the purification more closely to the cleansing of pollution, while others frame it as atonement for his need to serve out a term under another ruler. What stays constant is the logic of subordination. Heracles, who had acted outside household order in the worst possible way, now has to accept an order imposed from above. The emphasis on compulsion matters. These deeds are not presented as heroic volunteer work. They are punishment, remedy, and divine assignment at once. This is also where Apollo's role becomes especially important. The god is not just delivering a sentence, he is the one who converts a broken life into a legible sacred program. Delphi often appears in Greek myth as the place where uncertainty is given form, though not necessarily mercy in any simple sense. The oracle does not erase guilt, it names a way through it. Heracles is told that he cannot return to ordinary status by private decision. He must undergo a sequence of labors that will test him publicly, repeatedly, and under supervision. In practical terms, that means his suffering is made visible and measurable. It is no longer only an inward burden or a hidden pollution. It becomes a defined course of action that others can witness and later retell. Some later traditions also preserve a darker, more compressed version of the same turning point. In those accounts, Heracles is not only ashamed, but profoundly destabilized, and the oracle is less a gentle path than a severe correction. The details vary, but the moral frame remains the same. The hero who has broken the deepest bond of kinship must now submit himself to a new bond of obligation. The road toward restoration will not feel like reward. It will feel like discipline. In that sense, purification is not the end of the problem. It is the beginning of the long and difficult process by which the problem is made bearable. That is why this chapter sits at the hinge of the entire myth. Before this moment, Heracles is defined by bloodline, power, and disaster. After it, he becomes the laboring hero the Greek world most often remembers. The oracle does not make him innocent, and it does not make the dead return. What it does is establish the strange second life that follows ruin. Heracles accepts punishment as the road toward restoration, and from that acceptance the labors begin. The first labor usually tells the audience what kind of hero Heracles will be from this point on. It is not a contest against an army or a god, but against a beast that cannot be handled in the usual way. In the best-known version, he is sent to Nemea, where a lion has been ravaging the land. The creature is dangerous not only because it is large, but because its hide cannot be pierced by ordinary weapons. Spears, arrows, and bronze all fail against it. That detail matters because the labor is not meant to be a simple test of strength. It is a test of judgment. Heracles begins with the methods any warrior would try. He shoots at the lion, he strikes with force. When that does not work, he closes in. The story then narrows to a struggle of endurance. In some versions, he corners the beast in a cave with 2 openings and blocks one exit to trap it. In others, the emphasis falls less on strategy than on persistence. Either way, the point is the same. Ordinary tools do not solve this problem. Heracles has to meet the lion on its own terms and then go beyond them. He finally subdues it with his hands, and later traditions describe him strangling it or crushing it until it can no longer resist. This is one of the clearest symbolic moments in the myth. After he kills the lion, Heracles strips off the pelt and wears it as a sign of the labor. The skin is often shown draped over his body, with the lion's head serving as a hood. In Greek and later Roman art, that image becomes one of the easiest ways to identify him. The story is not only that he killed a lion, it is that he turned the defeated monster into his public emblem. What once made the beast untouchable becomes the sign of the hero's authority. Ancient tradition also places the Nemean lion in a wider religious landscape. Some local accounts connected the monster to Nemea itself, and later writers tried to explain why the labor belonged there. As with many Greek myths, the place was not incidental. It tied the story to a sanctuary region and to a recognizable route in the Peloponnese. The labor worked on 2 levels at once. It was the defeat of a monster, and it was a mythic explanation for why Heracles belonged in the memory of that place. That connection mattered to local identity. A sanctuary or festival site could be linked to a hero's deed, and the story helped preserve the meaning of the landscape long after the original ritual setting had faded. There are also differences in how the killing is told. Some authors make the struggle longer and more detailed than others. Some stress that Heracles was forced to rely on his own body because his arrows and sword were useless. Others move more quickly to the result and dwell instead on the skin afterward. Later artistic tradition often compresses the whole scene into a single recognizable pose. Heracles standing with the lion's hide over his shoulders, club in hand, already changed by the act. But the older narrative logic remains intact. The first labor matters because it establishes a pattern. Heracles does not simply overpower danger. He learns how to recognize when force alone is not enough. That lesson is easy to miss if the lion story is treated only as a triumph. In Greek heroic culture, a labor often reveals character by stripping away convenience. Heracles begins as the man famous for strength, but the Nemean lion is stronger in a narrow sense, because its hide resists ordinary force. So the labor turns strength into patience, and patience into technique. It is a controlled victory, not a reckless one. That distinction becomes important in the tasks that follow. The tale also helps explain why Heracles' image in later culture is so consistent. Once he has the lion's skin, he is no longer just a man who can wrestle beasts. He becomes a figure marked by a past ordeal, and that visible sign tells the audience that the struggle has already changed him. By the time the lion is dead and its skin taken, Heracles has done more than complete a task for Eurystheus. He has entered the role that will define him in the rest of the cycle. The first labor gives him his most recognizable symbol, and it also marks the beginning of a public life, governed by trial after trial. He survives by adapting, and that survival becomes visible in the lion skin he now wears. The next labor raises the challenge in a different way. The Nemean lion showed that Heracles could endure what ordinary weapons could not solve. The Lernaean Hydra showed something harder, a danger that did not stay wounded. In the common Greek tradition, the Hydra lived in the marshes near Lerna in Argolis, a place already tied to old ritual and deep water. Lerna was not just a setting, it had local religious importance, and placing the monster there gave the labor a rooted, familiar place in Greek memory. The creature is usually described as a many-headed serpent, though the number of heads varies across sources. The central point stays the same. When one head was cut off, another could grow in its place. That detail makes the monster less a simple enemy than a problem of regeneration. Strength alone can break something open. It cannot always keep it from becoming dangerous again. Eurystheus sends Heracles against the Hydra as another test, and in most versions Heracles goes with his nephew and companion Iolaus. That partnership matters because the myth does not present the labor as a simple contest of force. Heracles does the fighting, but Iolaus helps solve the creature's unnatural persistence. In the best-known account, Heracles cuts down the heads and Iolaus cauterizes the stumps so they cannot grow back. Fire is not used here for spectacle. It is a practical answer to a threat that heals itself. The labor becomes a lesson in method. Heracles has to understand how the enemy works before he can finish it. In some tellings, the swamp itself makes the battle harder, turning it into a slow and awkward struggle rather than a clean, heroic contest. The setting reinforces the point. This is not an open duel between two figures on level ground, but a fight in a place that resists direct control. Ancient sources do not always tell the story in exactly the same way. Some give more attention to Athena, who sometimes appears as a helper or advisor. Some reduce Iolaus to a background role. Later, mythographers sometimes add the detail of a giant crab sent by Hera to distract Heracles. In those versions, the crab is killed and Hera places it among the stars. But the labor itself remains the same at its core, a monster that cannot be finished by one blow. The variations are part of the tradition's history. Different authors kept the basic labor, but adjusted the supporting details according to local interest or literary emphasis. There is also a practical side to the myth that later tellers preserve. The Hydra's poison becomes important. In some versions, Heracles dips his arrows into the creature's venom after the labor, making the monster's own substance into a future source of danger. That helps explain why his arrows can later be treated as deadly beyond ordinary measure. It also shows how myth often works backward. A famous weapon or effect in a hero's later career is given an origin in an earlier labor. The Hydra is not only a defeated monster, it becomes part of the explanation for how Heracles will fight afterward. Eurystheus does not always respond to the labor in the same way, either. In the standard counting of the labors, the Hydra is one of the 12, but some versions reduce its formal value because Heracles received help from Iolaus. That matters because the list of labors was not fixed in a single early source. Different tellers counted differently, and the later canonical number of 12 reflects a tradition that settled over time. The objection Eurystheus raises, when it appears, is not just petty control. It reflects an ancient concern with what counts as a true trial. If someone else helped, should the labor count in the same way? Greek myth often preserves those arguments instead of smoothing them away. The next two tasks bring out another side of Heracles' character. The Ceryneian hind is not a creature he can simply overpower in the same way as a serpent in a marsh. In the common version, he must pursue it for a long time, sometimes over an entire year, until he can capture it alive. The animal belongs to Artemis, which makes the labor sensitive in a way that ordinary hunting is not. Heracles has to prove restraint. He must master speed without destroying what he is ordered to seize. Some accounts stress the chase, others the delicacy of the capture. But the point is not bloodshed, it is endurance. The Erymanthian boar gives the opposite lesson. Here the task is to drive a dangerous animal out of the wild and bring it under control, and in some tellings Heracles traps it in deep snow before carrying it back. That image is memorable because it shows the hero not as someone trapped inside one method, but as someone who can adapt to landscape and season. He can hunt, but he can also wait. He can kill, but he can also contain. These two labors make a useful pair. The hind tests restraint, the boar tests force handled carefully. Between them, they show Heracles becoming a hero of mixed skills rather than raw power alone. By this point, the pattern is clear. Each labor reveals a different weakness in a dangerous world. Some dangers require endurance, some require patience, some require help. The Hydra matters because it makes that fact impossible to miss. A monster that grows back teaches the hero that a clean strike is not always enough. After the hind and the boar, the tradition keeps pushing Heracles into situations where strength alone is not enough. One labor asks for patience with what is sacred. The other asks for control in the face of raw violence. Together, they show a hero learning how to deal with different kinds of danger. The Ceryneian hind belongs to the quieter side of the myths. In the most familiar version, Heracles is ordered to bring it back alive, and that detail matters. This is not a beast to be slain and counted as a trophy. It is tied to Artemis, and later tellers often describe it as golden-horned, though the surviving traditions do not always agree on every feature. Heracles pursues it across long ground through winter and into the far north. The story stresses endurance more than combat. He follows, waits, and keeps going. The hunt becomes a test of discipline because the goal is capture, not destruction. That is why the ending of the labor is so memorable. Heracles finally secures the animal only after a prolonged chase, and in some versions he carries it back rather than forcing a struggle at the end. The point is not that he has outmuscled a fragile creature. The point is that he has obeyed a difficult command in a way that preserves the hind's sacred status. In Greek myth, that kind of restraint is rarely accidental. It marks the difference between a brute who only knows how to strike and a hero who can submit his strength to a higher demand. The Erymanthian boar moves in the opposite direction. Here the danger is not graceful, but aggressive and destructive. Heracles is sent into a rugged landscape to bring back a boar that threatens the region around Mount Erymanthus. In later storytelling, he drives the animal into deep snow, which slows it and gives him the advantage. That detail may reflect the old narrative's interest in practical skill as much as force. Snow is not just scenery, it is part of the method. Heracles uses the land itself to control what he cannot safely meet head-on. The boar tradition also leaves room for smaller episodes around the main task. In some accounts, Heracles visits the centaur Pholus on the way, and that meeting leads into another violent chain of events involving wine, other centaurs, and the problem of uncontrolled force. Those stories belong to the wider cycle around the labor, rather than to its core in every source, but they reinforce the same point. Heracles does not move through a settled world. He moves through places where boundaries break down, where humans, beasts, and divine or semi-divine beings collide, and where victory depends on using more than muscle alone. What makes these two labors work so well together is their contrast. The hind is associated with pursuit, sanctity, and restraint. The boar is associated with direct threat, hard terrain, and the need to subdue a creature that cannot simply be wished away. One labor asks Heracles to be careful enough not to violate what he has been sent to take. The other asks him to be decisive enough to stop a danger that has to be contained. In both cases, the hero succeeds by adapting. He can hunt, but he can also hold back. He can track for a long time, but he can also use the terrain when the time comes. That combination matters for the larger pattern of the labors. The tradition keeps refusing to let Heracles remain a one-dimensional hero. Each task teaches a different limit. Some require patience, some speed, some technique, and some a willingness to let the world itself become part of the solution. By the time he returns from the stag and the boar, Heracles has shown that he can master both the disciplined chase and the violent confrontation. He has also shown that these labors are not isolated episodes, but part of a larger training in judgment. A hero who can overpower an enemy still has to know when to wait, when to bind, and when to carry out a command without breaking its meaning. That is one reason these stories stayed useful in later Greek storytelling. They could be read as adventures, but they also explain what kind of excellence the culture admired. Strength without control is not enough, and speed without discernment is not enough either. The hind asks for reverence toward what belongs to a god. The boar asks for practical intelligence in the face of a creature that threatens ordinary life. The next labor changes the kind of intelligence Heracles has to show. He is sent to clean the stables of Augeas, king of Elis, whose herds were said in later tradition to be immense, and whose pens had been allowed to fill with years of waste. Ancient sources do not agree on the exact size of the herd or even the precise wording of the challenge, but the point is consistent. Heracles is given a task that is degrading, huge, and meant to be impossible through ordinary labor. It is not a hunt or a fight. It is a test of whether strength can solve something that has become stubborn through neglect and time. That detail matters because shame is built into the labor. Augeas is wealthy, and his wealth has become disorderly. The problem is not only dirt in a stable, it is the visible failure of a ruler who has let abundance turn into burden. Greek myth often uses this kind of service to expose a household's weakness. Heracles is made to handle what a king has failed to handle himself, and the task turns private disorder into public evidence. The famous part of the story is that Heracles does not do it by hand. In the usual version, he diverts rivers, most often the Alpheus and Peneus, and uses the moving water to wash the stables clean in a single day. This is one of the clearest moments in the labors where raw force is not enough by itself. Heracles still relies on strength, but he uses it to plan. He changes the landscape so that the landscape does the work. The result is admired because it is practical and audacious at once. It is also the kind of answer Greek myth often rewards, not just endurance, but intelligence. The setting helps explain why the labor stayed memorable. Elis was a real region in the Western Peloponnese, later associated with Olympia and the games of Zeus there. Augeas appears in several traditions as a local ruler with unusual wealth and livestock, which made him a fitting figure for stories about abundance gone wrong. The stables become a place where plenty has turned to waste because no one has managed it. That inversion matters. The labor is not set in a battlefield or a wilderness, but in the administrative world of a household that has failed at basic order. Later traditions disagree about whether Augeas promised payment and then refused it, or whether Heracles had been ordered under conditions that made the task more than a simple cleaning contract. Some accounts say Augeas denied that the labor counted because the rivers, not Heracles' hands, had done the work. Others make that dispute part of a longer conflict that later returns to Elis. The important point is that the labor becomes a story about recognition and cheating. Heracles completes the task by clever means, and the king tries to deny him credit. In some versions, that refusal has consequences beyond the labor itself. Broken promises often lead to later trouble in Greek myth, and this episode can be read that way too. The task is finished, but the dispute is not. The stables are clean, yet the issue of payment and honor remains unsettled. That tension is why the labor stands out. It turns filth into proof of power. It also turns a practical problem into a demonstration of scale. Rivers are not ordinary tools. To redirect them is to show command over the limits of place itself. In the wider sequence of the labors, this is an important shift. Heracles is no longer only the man who overpowers a beast. He is the man who can solve an obstacle by reorganizing the environment around it. That kind of feat belongs to a hero whose strength is matched by inventiveness. After the stables, the next labors pull Heracles into two different kinds of difficulty. One brings him up against creatures that cannot be met with ordinary force. The other sends him into the political world of another people, where gifts, rank, and misunderstanding matter as much as strength. In both cases, the stories preserve a hero who still solves problems by unusual means, but who is also moving beyond the simple image of a beast slayer. The Stymphalian birds belong to this middle stretch of the labor sequence, and the ancient sources do not describe them in exactly the same way. In the most familiar version, they live near Lake Stymphalus in Arcadia, where marshy ground and thick vegetation make them hard to approach. Some traditions say they were dangerous because of metal beaks, claws, or feathers, while others emphasize the harm they did simply by swarming in great numbers and attacking people or crops. Their threat is not the threat of a single monster in open combat. It is the threat of a hard-to-reach problem hidden in difficult terrain. That detail matters because the labor is not just about killing an animal, it is about dealing with a place where ordinary movement breaks down and where danger cannot be met head-on without a plan. That is why the labor is often remembered for the method, not just the result. Heracles cannot simply charge into a swamp and outfight a flock. Later traditions say Athena helps him, and in some accounts he uses a bronze rattle or castanet-like instrument to startle the birds into the air. Once they rise, he can shoot them down. Other versions vary the detail, but the pattern remains the same. He succeeds by creating the conditions for victory. The labor fits the broader sequence because it shows intelligence working beside force. It is another example of Heracles turning a local danger into a public demonstration of control. In the logic of the labors, that control has meaning beyond the immediate problem. It proves that a man might master what cannot be seized directly, whether through divine help, crafted equipment, or a better understanding of the terrain. The Stymphalian birds also fit a Greek habit of explaining places through myth. Lake Stymphalus in Arcadia was a real location, and the story helps turn a difficult landscape into a remembered site of heroic action. That does not mean the myth is a straightforward record of anything historical. It means the place mattered enough to receive a story that explained its dangers in heroic terms. By the time the tale reaches us in later literary and artistic forms, the birds have become one more sign that Heracles does not just kill what stands in front of him. He finds the hidden source of the problem and breaks it open. In that sense, the labor belongs to a larger pattern in the cycle. Each task strips away a different kind of obstacle, and each one tests a different kind of competence. From there, the sequence moves west and then outward into a different social world. The labor involving Hippolyta's belt is often called the quest for the girdle of the Amazon queen, and here too, the ancient evidence does not tell only one story. In the best-known Greek tradition, Eurystheus wants the belt as a gift for his daughter, and Heracles sails to the land of the Amazons to obtain it. The belt itself is usually treated as a sign of royal authority, a distinctive emblem of Hippolyta's status. In that sense, the labor is not about treasure in a simple material sense. It is about a symbol of rule taken from a foreign queen. That makes the task politically charged from the beginning. Heracles is not merely collecting an object. He is entering a world where the object stands for legitimacy, and where taking it away changes the meaning of power itself. Some versions make Hippolyta sympathetic at first. She may be willing to give the belt to Heracles peacefully, especially after learning who he is and why he has come. But Hera intervenes again, and the encounter turns hostile. In one tradition, Hera spreads suspicion among the Amazons, who then attack Heracles' party. In the confusion, Hippolyta is killed, and the belt is taken by force. In another version, Heracles has already come expecting resistance, and the exchange is never truly peaceful. A later strand of myth even places another Amazon, Antiope, in the story, and links her more directly to Heracles' movements. The details shift from author to author, but the larger pattern stays consistent. A mission that might have ended in diplomacy is undone by mistrust and violence. The story keeps returning to the possibility that the labor could have ended differently, and that is part of what gives the episode its shape. It is a tale about a near exchange that collapses before it can become stable. This is important because the Amazon episode is not simply another monster tale. It places Heracles in a world defined by foreign customs and female sovereignty, a world Greek authors often described as distant, exceptional, and unsettling. The Amazons appear throughout Greek myth as a people who live beyond ordinary civic order, and their placement in the story tells us as much about Greek imagination as about Heracles himself. He is not only confronting a queen, he is moving through a boundary between Greek heroic space and a more alien political landscape, where gifts can be misread and intentions can collapse into conflict. The labor, therefore, has a different kind of pressure from the one at Stymphalos. There, the issue was terrain and concealment. Here, the issue is social meaning. Who has the right to give, who has the right to ask, and what happens when a sign of authority is removed from its original setting. The story also has a wider afterlife in art and literature. Vase paintings, and later retellings, often compress the episode into a single dramatic encounter, but the older literary traditions leave room for uncertainty about who attacked first and whether peace was possible. That ambiguity matters. It keeps the labor from becoming a simple triumph over an enemy. Instead, it becomes a story about how quickly a mission of exchange can become a battle once suspicion takes hold. It also shows how Greek myth could turn a political encounter into an emblem of larger anxieties about outsiders, women in power, and the unstable line between gift and seizure. Taken together, the birds and the belt show how flexible the labors can be. One is solved by producing noise and forcing hidden danger into the open. The other is tangled in diplomacy and the collapse of trust. Both move Heracles beyond the straightforward contest with a beast. From there, the tradition turns outward again, toward the far western edge of the Greek world, where myth places strange kings, enormous herds, and landmarks that mark the boundary between the familiar and the unknown. This is the labor of Gerion's cattle, one of the clearest examples of how Heracles' story expands across geography as well as danger. In some versions, Eurystheus simply commands him to bring back the cattle of Gerion from Erythea, a remote island or region set far beyond the Mediterranean horizon. Later writers often imagine the journey as reaching the ends of the earth itself. That matters because the labor is not just about taking cattle, it is about crossing into a place Greek tradition treated as distant, difficult, and only partly mapped. A far western island, a strait, or an ocean boundary could become a marker of where human travel ended and myth began. Before Heracles reaches Gerion, the journey itself becomes part of the story. Ancient sources place him moving westward through lands later tradition associated with the straits near Iberia, North Africa, or the edge of the ocean. In some accounts, he grows so frustrated by the heat that he shoots at the sun, and Helios, rather than punish him, gives him a golden cup or vessel to sail across the sea. That detail appears in later literary tradition and helps explain how Heracles can move through a world ordinary travel would not easily allow. It also shows how myth uses divine help to bridge impossible distances. The hero is not simply marching across a map, he is being carried into a region where the usual rules are suspended. In that same Western setting, later Greeks also placed other signs of his passage, so the labor became part of a broader network of stories attached to coasts, straits, and open water. At the center of the labor stands Gerion, described in different ways by different ancient authors, but usually as a monstrous king or herdsman with more than one body or one set of limbs. Early Greek poetry already treats him as exceptional, and later art and mythography emphasize his unusual appearance. He is often accompanied by the cattle themselves, which are not merely livestock, but a prized possession guarded as if they were part of royal power. The herd is watched over by Orthrus, a two-headed dog, and by the herdsman Eurytion. These names matter because the labor is not only a test of Heracles against a single monster, It is a layered encounter with guardians, property, and the force used to protect wealth at the far edge of the world. In older Greek imagination, cattle were a measure of status and wealth, and a herd like this could stand for the resources of an entire realm. Heracles kills Orthrus first in most versions, then Eurytion, and finally Geryon himself. The broad outline is stable, but the details vary. In some accounts, Geryon is struck by an arrow poisoned with the Hydra's venom, a reminder that the earlier labors continue to shape the later ones. That connection is one of the quiet structures of the whole cycle. Heracles does not finish one task and move on cleanly to the next. He carries his tools, victories, and contaminations with him. The arrow that once helped him destroy a creature of multiple heads now helps him end a different, equally distant threat. Myth here is cumulative. Later poets sometimes add more local color to the fight, but the essential pattern remains the same. The hero overcomes the keepers first, then the owner of the herd, and only then can he begin the harder work of getting the animals back. After the fighting, the cattle still have to be driven home, and that return becomes another kind of trial. The herd is not passive cargo. It must be moved across seas, borders, and contested ground. Ancient stories describe theft, pursuit, and interference along the way. Sometimes local kings or hostile groups try to seize the animals. Sometimes Heracles himself becomes the agent of disorder, striking down anyone who blocks the route. The labor has a practical structure, but the myth gives it a broader meaning. Moving cattle from a remote land back to Greece turns Heracles into a figure of transfer, one who brings wealth from the margins into the center. That was an important heroic pattern in Greek tradition. A hero proves himself not only by killing monsters, but by returning with something that can be recognized, counted, and claimed. In a society where cattle still signified value, mobility, and status, the return of the herd could stand for the recovery of spoils, the assertion of power, or the extension of Greek influence into imagined borderlands. The story was also attached to real places. Later Greek and Roman tradition linked Heracles to markers in the Western Mediterranean, especially the so-called Pillars of Heracles, usually identified with the Straits at Gibraltar. Whether those associations were already fixed in the earliest versions is uncertain, but by the time the myth is fully developed, the labor helps explain how the Far West became part of the hero's map. This is one reason the episode lasted so well in art and literature. It joins a heroic combat story to a geography of extremity. The cattle belong at the edge of the world, and Heracles has to go there to take them. The same episode could also make sense to audiences who knew the Western Sea through trade and travel, since it transformed distant contact zones into places where a famous Greek hero had already left his mark. By the time he completes the task, he has crossed one of the most distant borders in the mythic cycle and returned with proof of it. The labor is not as compact as the Nemean lion or as technically difficult as the Hydra. Its scale is wider. Among the labors, the search for the apples of the Hesperides is one of the least stable in the surviving tradition, and that uncertainty is part of its importance. The apples are usually described as golden fruit from a divine garden at the edge of the world, a place linked with immortality, sacred order, and gifts mortals were not meant to take freely. In some versions, the trees belong directly to Hera, either as a wedding gift or as part of her sacred domain. In others, the garden was watched by the Hesperides, the nymphs of the West, while a serpent or dragon guarded the trees themselves. The story is never only about fruit. It is about access to what remains closed and about the difference between heroic labor and divine possession. Heracles cannot simply rush the garden and seize the apples. That would break the logic of the myth. The treasure belongs to a realm beyond ordinary human reach, so the story turns toward cunning, negotiation, and delegated action. In one of the best-known versions, Heracles finds Atlas, the titan who holds up the sky. That detail matters because Atlas already lives at the edge of order and burden. He is not a local king or a random helper. He is one of the old beings of cosmic history, and his involvement gives the labor a wider mythic scale. Heracles asks Atlas to fetch the apples while he temporarily takes over the Titan's task of bearing the heavens. The exchange is striking because it reverses the expected pattern. The hero wins not by overpowering the guardian directly, but by offering to carry a burden so immense that it belongs outside human measure. Here the ancient sources begin to diverge. Some tell the story in a straightforward way. Atlas brings the apples, and Heracles then tricks him into resuming the sky burden by asking him to relieve him for a moment while he adjusts the load. Others preserve a version in which Heracles never enters the garden himself at all, but relies entirely on Atlas. In still another tradition, Heracles approaches the garden more directly and kills the guardian serpent, or he receives guidance from a divine figure such as Prometheus, who is sometimes said to have advised him on how to find the fruit. These are not minor differences. They show that later authors reshaped the labor into different moral and narrative patterns: clever deception, divine help, or brute force against a monster. The most familiar literary account is often connected with Apollodorus, who summarizes myth in a relatively systematic form. There, Heracles is sent west, learns where the garden lies, and uses Atlas as the key to the apples. But the broader tradition does not always agree on whether the hero should be imagined as outwitting Atlas, receiving the fruit through a bargain, or confronting the garden's defenses more directly. Greek vase painting and later art can favor one moment over another, especially the image of Heracles supporting the sky while Atlas returns with the apples. That scene became popular because it captures several of the hero's defining qualities at once: endurance, intelligence, and the ability to stand where ordinary people would fail. The apples themselves are not important because of their physical description. Their symbolic force comes from what they represent. In Greek myth, gardens at the edge of the world often stand for unreachable plenty, a kind of abundance preserved by distance, danger, and divine arrangement. The Hesperides belong to that pattern. Their orchard is a place where nature is ordered, guarded, and separated from human consumption. To enter that space, or even to obtain its fruit, is to cross a line between mortal striving and divine privilege. That is why the labor feels different from the earlier tasks. Heracles is not hunting a beast or cleaning a stable. He is reaching towards something that belongs to a more protected layer of the mythic world. The labor also has a quieter relationship to kingship and service. Eurystheus demands the apples, but he does not truly possess the world that produces them. Heracles is the one who moves through the margins of the known world and returns with evidence that he has done so. The apples become proof not only of obedience, but of access. He has reached into a realm of divine order and come back with something that should not be easy to remove. In that sense, the labor is about more than winning a prize. It shows that Heracles can cross into spaces governed by cosmic beings, use both strength and intelligence, and return without losing his place among the living. Some versions place additional emphasis on Heracles' route to the garden, and that route matters because it reinforces the sense that the labor is a journey to the western boundary of the world. Ancient Greek imagination often located the Hesperides in a remote western zone, sometimes near the place where the sun sets, sometimes near waters or islands at the edge of the earth. That geography is not fixed in the way a modern map would require, but the direction itself is consistent. West was the place of twilight, distance, and uncertain borders. It was where a hero might encounter beings older than human cities and older than human law. Even when the detail changes from one poet to another, the effect remains the same. Heracles is sent far beyond the ordinary landscape of Greece into a mythic margin where access is controlled. The involvement of Atlas gives the labor another layer of meaning. Atlas is not simply a helper. He is a figure of cosmic punishment and endurance, one of the beings marked by the aftermath of the struggle between the Olympians and the older generation of gods. By placing Heracles in direct contact with Atlas, the myth ties the hero's service to the deeper structure of divine history. It also creates a strange symmetry. Heracles, who is still mortal in origin, temporarily bears the heavens, while Atlas, who has long held that burden, briefly acts as the errand runner. The myth does not present this as a clean transfer of power. It presents it as a momentary suspension of ordinary hierarchy, and that suspension is what makes the episode memorable. The later tradition often returns to the trick at the end of the episode. Heracles, having received the apples, finds a way not to remain trapped under the sky. In the best-known form, he asks Atlas to take the heavens back for just a moment so that he can adjust the load or set something in place. Once Atlas resumes the burden, Heracles leaves with the fruit. The logic of the scene depends on a small but important asymmetry. Atlas is powerful, but he is also bound. Heracles is powerful too, yet he can still move on. That difference explains why the episode has lasted in mythic memory. It is not merely a contest of strength. It is a contest between different kinds of constraint. By the time the story ends, the Apple Quest has added another layer to his reputation. He is no longer only the man who defeats monsters or endures harsh commands. He is also the hero who can approach the guarded fruit of immortality itself, however briefly, and bring back a sign of that unreachable abundance. The last labor brings Heracles to the clearest boundary in Greek myth. If the earlier tasks tested him against animals, rivers, distance, and skill, this one asks him to enter the world of the dead and return alive. In the later tradition best known from tragedy and mythography, Eurystheus orders him to bring back Cerberus, the dog that guards the entrance to Hades. The demand is extreme, and that is the point. Heracles is sent to a place ordinary heroes do not visit, and from which ordinary mortals do not return. The path into the underworld is not fixed in the surviving sources. Different authors place the descent in different regions and give different helpers or instructions. What stays constant is the shape of the trial. Heracles must go below, meet the boundary between life and death, and prove that his strength is not limited to the daylight world. In some versions, he receives divine guidance before he descends. In others, the journey is described more briefly, as if the important fact is simply that he went and came back. That return matters as much as the descent itself. A one-way journey would make him another dead soul in the underworld's order. Coming back shows that he can cross a limit without being held by it. Cerberus carries older symbolic weight than a single monster hunt. In Greek tradition, the underworld is guarded, ordered, and difficult to enter. The dog belongs to that structure. It is not merely an enemy to be killed, and in many versions, Heracles is not told to kill it at all. He is to seize it and bring it up while respecting the god who rules the dead. That detail matters, because the labor is less about destruction than about controlled trespass. Heracles does not conquer death in a simple sense. He negotiates passage through it. The myth insists that such passage is possible only under conditions, and only for a figure whose strength is matched by unusual divine favor. Later tellings vary on how Heracles manages the encounter. Some traditions emphasize wrestling. Others stress that he used no weapons and relied on his own body and resolve. In a few accounts, he is aided by divine permission or by the guidance of mysteries associated with Eleusis, though these details belong more securely to later explanatory traditions than to one early narrative. What remains consistent is that Cerberus is brought up alive. Eurystheus, who has demanded the impossible, is then frightened by the sight of what Heracles has accomplished. The king's fear matters almost as much as the hero's success. It reinforces the imbalance between the labor itself and the man who ordered it. Eurystheus can issue commands, but he cannot truly master the boundaries those commands cross. This labor also changes the meaning of the whole cycle. In the earlier tasks, Heracles repeatedly shows that he can overcome dangerous creatures, hostile landscapes, and royal demands. Here, he proves something harder. He can enter the domain where human strength usually ends. That does not make him a god yet, but it places him closer to the divine border than any previous deed. Greek audiences would have recognized the significance of that crossing. The underworld is not just another location. It is the place where the dead are gathered, where the normal order of human life no longer applies, and where return is not expected. A hero who comes back from there has shown a rare kind of endurance, one that includes survival beyond the ordinary limits of mortality. Some later accounts turn the final labor into public astonishment, but the more important ancient idea is quieter. Heracles fulfills a command that should have ended in failure, and he comes back with proof that the boundary was crossed. That achievement does not erase the suffering that still lies ahead in his story. It does, however, complete one part of his reputation. He is now the hero who has worked his way through the whole range of the world, above and below, from hunted beasts to sacred spaces to the house of the dead. The next stages of his myth will gather that reputation into further wanderings and new acts of strength, but the descent to Cerberus has already shown the central pattern. Heracles can go where others cannot, face what others cannot face, and return from death's realm as if even that passage were another labor. The episode also explains why the labors were remembered as a sequence rather than as isolated feats. Each task narrows the space in which Heracles can fail, yet each one reveals a different kind of constraint. The Nemean lion tested brute force, the Hydra tested persistence against multiplication. The cleansing of Augeas' stables involved labor, wit, and the recognition that a heroic act could be tied to practical cleansing rather than battlefield glory. The descent for Cerberus brings those earlier lessons together in a final, concentrated form. It requires strength, but also restraint. It requires a hero to enter a place ruled by another god and to return without turning the journey into a seizure of power for its own sake. That is one reason the underworld labor remained especially flexible in later literature. Some poets and mythographers preferred to dwell on the route, others on the struggle with the dog, and still others on the shock at Eurystheus' court. Vase paintings and later summaries often present the scene with an economy that shows how widely the story was known. A single image of Heracles leading Cerberus upward could carry the whole sequence in shorthand. The audience did not need every step explained to understand the basic claim. He had gone below and returned. In Greek myth, that was enough to mark a figure as exceptional. The final labor, then, is not only the last item in a list, it is the moment when the list reaches beyond the ordinary world altogether. Once the major labors are complete, Heracles does not disappear from the myths. That is part of what makes him such a durable figure. The fixed list of 12 labors gives the story a clear spine, but ancient tradition did not treat that list as the whole of his career. Different poets, local cults, and later mythographers attached further deeds to his name, sometimes as episodes after the labors, sometimes as stories folded into them, and sometimes as older regional tales that were later brought into the Heracles cycle. Many of these extra deeds follow the same broad pattern as the labors themselves. Heracles clears away a danger that ordinary force cannot easily solve. In Thessaly and elsewhere, he is credited with killing or driving off violent local threats, dealing with bandits, monsters, and arrogant kings, and making roads safer for travel. In many versions, this is not one continuous campaign, but a series of local interventions. A town remembers that Heracles passed through, defeated its enemy, and left the community in better shape than he found it. That kind of story mattered because it joined heroic prestige to local memory. A city could claim that Heracles had acted there, and in doing so connect itself to the wider authority of Greek myth. In a world where sanctuaries, family traditions, and civic identities often overlapped, that was no small thing. A Heracles story could support a festival, explain a monument, or give a place an honor older than its current political order. One familiar example is the story of the Moleonidae, or Moleone brothers, in which Heracles confronts formidable opponents associated with Elis. The details vary, and some traditions place the struggle among conflicts that lead into or accompany later royal disputes. The larger pattern is steady enough. Heracles is no longer only the man who serves Eurystheus, he becomes a roaming champion whose strength can be called upon in disputes that sit outside the formal labor list. That is also why some ancient sources keep extending his itinerary. If a region had a tale about an oppressive ruler, a dangerous beast, or a rescue, Heracles often became the figure who resolved it. In some local versions, the emphasis is not even on extraordinary monsters, but on practical obstacles, such as a route made dangerous by raiders or a district unsettled by conflict. The myth takes a historical-looking problem and gives it a heroic cause and solution. The evidence for these additions is uneven. Homer and Hesiod know a powerful Heracles, but they do not hand down one fully standardized biography. Later epic, lyric poetry, tragedy, local history, and mythography all contribute pieces, and vase painting shows that some episodes were already familiar visually even when the surviving literary record is incomplete. Because of that, modern retellings have to be careful about what counts as a labor and what counts as a later enlargement. The numbering itself is not always fixed in early tradition. The familiar 12 is a later ordering principle, useful for shaping the myth, but not always the only way ancient audiences thought about Heracles' work. Some episodes appear in early poetry as independent feats and are only later folded into a larger sequence. Others remain stubbornly local, preserved by a city or sanctuary even when they do not fit the best-known version of the hero's life. That is why these borderline deeds matter. They show how flexible the myth was. A task might be too important to leave out, but not regular enough to fit neatly among the formal labors imposed by Eurystheus. In some versions, Heracles continues to perform acts of cleansing and restoration after the main sequence has ended, as though the world keeps producing new disorder for him to correct. In others, those same stories are attached to his later wanderings after the period of service has passed. Either way, the narrative logic stays close to the same idea. Heracles is a force that moves through the Greek world, breaking apart danger wherever it settles. That movement also helps explain the uneven chronology of the myths. A deed may happen before one of the labors in one source and after it in another, not because the tradition is careless, but because different communities cared about different parts of the hero's life. The extra deeds also help explain why so many communities claimed him. A strictly ordered hero, defined only by one central task, would belong mainly to one palace and one king. Heracles belongs everywhere. He clears monsters from one district, frees another from a tyrant, and passes into yet another as guest, ally, or avenger. That mobility made him useful to local tradition. It also made the story feel larger than any single sequence of events. Even after the labors are finished, the myths do not treat him as complete. His fame has become too broad for that. Later storytellers could bring him into almost any setting where exceptional strength, divine favor, or violent correction were needed. The figure remained recognizable even as the episodes changed. This is especially clear in the stories that place him among kings and households. A ruler may test him, hire him, oppose him, or simply benefit from his presence. A local problem may become a heroic episode. Some traditions even keep a tension between Heracles as a civilizing helper and Heracles as a dangerous, unstable force. He can cleanse a region, but he can also bring violence with him. Ancient audiences did not always separate those two sides. That tension is part of the figure. It is one reason he remains so prominent in both myth and cult. Heracles can be invoked as a defender, but his power is never mild. The same strength that clears a road can destroy a household, and the myths do not pretend otherwise. So when the later myths continue his career, they are not straying from the main story, they are showing what the main story already implied. A hero who has mastered the lion, the Hydra, the cattle of a far western king, and the threshold of the dead cannot remain confined to a single list. His name keeps attaching itself to new tasks because the old ones never exhausted his reputation. Once the labors are behind him, the stories do not settle. In many versions, Heracles remains a figure whose strength is needed everywhere and never fully contained by any one city. He appears in the service of kings, in disputes between households, in rescue stories, in raids, and in foundation legends of places that wanted to claim him as part of their own past. That is one reason his myth spread so widely. A hero like Heracles could be attached to local history without losing his larger identity. He could arrive as a helper, but he could also leave behind ruin, which made him useful to storytellers trying to explain both order and disorder. Some of these later tales are brief and practical. A ruler may ask Heracles to hunt a dangerous beast, drive off enemies, or settle a problem no ordinary man can manage. In other accounts, he becomes a guest whose arrival changes the fate of a royal house. Greek myth often uses that pattern to show how power behaves when it enters human society. Heracles brings protection, but he also brings risk. He does not belong to the everyday world in the way a farmer or king does. He can strengthen a household, yet his presence can expose its weakness. That double role follows him from one region to another. One recurring theme is his encounter with kings who do not know how to handle him. Some welcome him and gain an ally. Others try to control him, cheat him, or test him. And the result is often predictable. Heracles is too large for ordinary social rank. He can be hired but not safely managed. In later local traditions, this made him an ideal figure for explaining why a community had once overcome danger, or why a boundary, road, shrine, or settlement bore his name. The myth can turn a single heroic deed into a charter for memory. The stories also expand beyond Greece itself. Heracles appears in distant places as well, especially in legends connected with the far west, the north, and the edges of the known world. These are not random additions. Ancient Greeks often imagined Heracles moving to the margins because the margins were where the impossible belonged. If a tale involved a hostile king, a strange river, a remote island, or an unexplored coast, Heracles was a natural figure to place there. He marked the place as both conquered and unsettled. Even when he brings back order, the story usually preserves the sense that what he touched was never fully ordinary. Several of the best-known episodes from this part of the tradition show him as both champion and wanderer. He may aid another ruler, win a contest, found a cult, or leave behind a line of descendants. He may also become entangled in the feuds of others. Later mythographers liked to collect these episodes because they made Heracles seem less like a character in a fixed plot and more like a force moving through the Greek imagination. He is not just the man who performed 12 labors, he is the hero whose name can be attached to almost any place where strength, travel, and danger meet. This is also the stage at which local traditions become especially important. Different cities remembered Heracles differently. One place emphasized his victories over enemies. Another preferred the image of a founder or benefactor. Another told of a visit that explained a shrine or ritual. The surviving evidence shows that these were not neat, unified stories. They were layers of memory, often preserved by poets, genealogists, and later mythographers who were trying to organize a much older and more scattered body of tradition. Vase paintings and inscriptions sometimes confirm how widely the figure circulated, but they rarely give a single stable sequence. The point is not that one version is right and the others are false. The point is that Heracles became useful wherever Greeks wanted to imagine strength moving through human life without fully belonging to it. That usefulness is also visible in the way later writers linked him to colonization, road building, and the taming of frontier spaces. When a community wanted to explain why a difficult passage was passable, why a shrine stood in a particular place, or why a family claimed descent from a celebrated figure, Heracles could be placed at the beginning of the story. In some cases, the connection may preserve a real local cult that had grown around the hero. In others, it may be a retrospective explanation created long after the fact. Either way, the pattern reveals how myth and civic memory work together. Heracles did not only belong to epic, he belonged to geography, ritual, and public identity. Some of the later traditions also soften him without removing his danger. He can be made into a host, a founder, or a companion on a journey, and in those settings he is not always the destructive figure of earlier stories, but even then, the memory of his violence remains close by. A tale may celebrate his help while also implying that no one should mistake him for an ordinary ally. That balance helped him remain flexible across centuries of retelling. He could serve a city's pride and still preserve the edge that made him famous. That is why the later myths keep him in motion. Even after all the great tasks are done, he is still the hero who can be sent, received, challenged, or feared. After the labors, the tradition does not let Heracles settle into rest for long. The next stage of his story turns away from monsters and toward home, marriage, and the way heroic violence can return in private form. The woman most often placed at the center of this tragedy is Deianeira. In the surviving sources, she is usually the daughter of Oeneus of Calydon, though later retellings sometimes adjust her family background. What remains steady is her role as the wife Heracles takes after his life has already been marked by suffering and fame. Heracles' route to Deianeira passes through Nessus, a river god or centaur in different versions. In the best-known account, Heracles and Deianeira need to cross a river, and Nessus offers to carry the woman while Heracles swims across. Once he has Deianeira in his arms, he tries to seize her for himself. Heracles answers from a distance with an arrow tipped in the poison of the Hydra, the same deadly substance that had already shaped earlier parts of his career. Before he dies, Nessus gives Deianeira a final instruction that becomes the center of the later disaster. Different sources explain that gift differently. In some traditions, Nessus tells Deianeira that his blood can serve as a love charm and preserve Heracles' fidelity. In others, the wording is less explicit, but the outcome is the same. Deianeira keeps the blood or a garment stained by it, believing it may help secure her marriage. The story is not just about jealousy. It is also about trust placed in an object whose meaning is misunderstood. Ancient myth often works this way. A small token can carry an entire chain of consequences, and the fatal turn begins long before the end is visible. For a time, Deianeira waits while Heracles continues through the world. After the labors, later tradition places him in service to different kings or in local wars, raids, and episodes of capture and release. In that broader setting, Deianeira receives word that Heracles has taken another woman, or at least that he has been publicly involved with someone else. The details vary. Later mythographers and tragedians do not always agree on the immediate trigger, and in some versions it is jealousy, while in others it is fear of abandonment. The consistent point is that Deianeira believes she is losing her place in Heracles' life. She then acts on Nessus' words. She sends Heracles a garment, often described as a robe or tunic, coated or treated with the substance she has kept. She intends it as a charm, not a weapon. The tragedy lies in the gap between intention and effect. Once Heracles puts it on, the poison begins to work. Some sources speak as if the garment itself is cursed. Others keep the emphasis on the Hydra poison carried through Nessus' blood. Either way, Heracles is undone by an object from his own household. Greek tragedy made especially powerful use of this sequence. Sophocles' Women of Trachis gives one of the most influential literary versions, and it emphasizes Deianeira's uncertainty rather than simple malice. She is not presented as a schemer. She is a wife caught between rumor, fear, and the possibility that a marriage built around a hero may still fail ordinary human tests. That is why the story has remained so durable. It joins misunderstanding, divine injury, and the instability of mortal life inside a single domestic act. The garment tradition is not the only version of the cause. Some later accounts shift the blame more directly onto Deianeira's jealousy, while others preserve the idea that she is deceived by Nessus from the beginning. There are also variations in how the fatal item is described. The sources can say robe, shirt, tunic, or cloak, depending on period and author. What matters is the same structural pattern. A gift meant to secure loyalty becomes the instrument of destruction. That pattern fits Heracles especially well because his life repeatedly joins power to vulnerability. He can overpower beasts and armies, yet he is still exposed to ordinary human dangers, including the limits of trust within marriage. When the poison takes hold, Heracles' household becomes the center of the final crisis. Deianeira realizes too late what she has done, and in some versions she kills herself out of shame and grief. Other traditions are less explicit, but all preserve the sense that the domestic sphere has collapsed around the hero. Heracles is no longer only the man of labors. He is now a husband whose home has become the place where divine hostility returns in another form. The story is moving toward a death that is not immediate and not clean, and that drawn-out ending is essential to how ancient audiences understood him. The surviving versions keep the emphasis on pain rather than spectacle. Heracles does not simply fall in battle. The poisoned garment clings to him, and the more he struggles, the more destructive it becomes. Later tradition often says that the Hydra's substance, mingled with Nessus' blood, burns into his flesh and cannot be removed. That detail is not only physical. It links the first part of his heroic career to the last. The labor that once proved his endurance leaves behind the agent of his destruction. In that sense, the story is tightly constructed, with the earlier mythic task returning as the hidden cause of the later collapse. This is also where the wider Greek world begins to matter. Heracles was not only a figure in a private family story, he was a major hero in cult, poetry, and local genealogy. Cities claimed him as an ancestor. Sanctuaries associated him with strength, protection, and transition. So when later storytellers placed him in the household of Deianeira, they were not shrinking him. The suffering begins in the ordinary language of household clothing, which is part of why the episode stayed so memorable. In the best-known literary version, the fatal object is not a weapon openly raised against Heracles, but a garment sent to him as if it were harmless. Deianeira has kept the blood of Nessus, believing it might preserve her husband's affection. The centaur had told her that the blood would work as a charm if she used it on a garment for Heracles. Later tradition makes clear that this was a deception. Nessus had already been killed by Heracles with an arrow tipped by the Hydra's venom, so his blood, mixed with that poison, becomes the hidden source of destruction. Once the cloth touches Heracles' body, the poison does not behave like a clean wound. It spreads through him, and the hero who has endured so much through strength alone finds himself facing something strength cannot remove. The ancient sources do not describe the moment in exactly the same way. Sophocles' Trachiniae gives one of the most influential versions, and there the domestic tragedy is shaped most fully. Deianeira sends the garment in good faith, then learns that the supposed charm is not a charm at all. In other traditions, especially later mythographic summaries, the emphasis falls more clearly on her error or on Nessus' deliberate fraud. Either way, the central point remains the same. The poison enters Heracles' life through a household act that should have meant care. Greek myth often uses this kind of reversal. What should protect instead injures, what should bind a family together becomes the instrument that breaks it apart. The role of the Hydra's venom matters because it links this final crisis back to the labors. Heracles has already used that poison as a tool against monstrous enemies, and the myths do not let him escape what he has carried forward from the Hydra. The same substance that helped him destroy danger returns through an indirect route and makes him vulnerable. That is a familiar pattern in Greek storytelling, where victory leaves behind something that cannot be fully controlled. Heracles' own power contributes to the condition of his death. The arrows that made him so effective as a monster slayer also ensure that the poison is especially deadly when it comes back to him. In that sense, the story is not only about betrayal by another person, it is also about the afterlife of violence itself and how an act once justified in combat can remain present long after the combat is over. The literary treatments of his pain differ, but they agree on its intensity and its helplessness. In Sophocles, the symptoms are severe enough to force a crisis of movement and understanding within the household. Heracles cannot remain where he is, and the language of the play turns toward exposure, confusion, and bodily torment. Later retellings often sharpen the physical detail, while some summary accounts move more quickly to the larger outcome. The hero realizes that the end has begun and no ordinary remedy can reverse it. Ancient authors did not always linger on the same features, but they consistently present this as a death by slow destruction rather than a single clean blow. That detail matters because it changes the kind of heroism the audience is asked to recognize. Heracles is not defeated in battle. He is undone by duration, by something that keeps working after the moment of contact has passed. That is one reason the episode feels different from the labors. The labors are external tasks. The hero confronts lions, serpents, birds, kings, and impossible distances. Here, by contrast, the enemy is inside the garment and inside his own body. The story narrows from world-scale struggle to intimate pain. It also narrows from public achievement to family collapse. Heracles has spent much of his life proving mastery in open conflict, yet the thing that brings him down is a private act tied to marriage, trust, and the fragile boundary between affection and harm. The poisoned shirt is therefore not only a plot device, it marks a symbolic turn in the Heracles cycle because it transforms the hero's greatest physical competence into a weakness against a domestic object. Some ancient versions make Deianeira's grief more central than others. In the tragic tradition, once she understands the effect of what she has sent, she is overwhelmed by shame and despair. Other accounts give less attention to her response and move the narrative toward Heracles' final commands. The variation matters because it changes the emotional center of the story, but it does not change the structure. The household is ruined from within, and the hero's body now carries a fate he cannot wrestle away. His suffering is not only punishment in a moral sense, it is also the end of a long chain of divine hostility, mistaken trust, and inherited violence. If the earlier labors showed him under pressure from the outside world, this episode shows how little control even a demigod has over trust, error, and the objects that pass between family members. By this point, Heracles is trapped between mortal pain and impossible escape. The end of Heracles appears in more than one form across the surviving tradition, but the versions agree on the main course of events. He is no longer in the middle of a labor or facing an enemy that can be defeated. He is trapped in a fate already set in motion, and the final movement of the story runs from household tragedy toward release. In the best-known literary accounts, the setting is Mount Oeta, where Heracles is brought after the poison has made his body unbearable to live in. The mountain matters because it is removed from ordinary life. It becomes the place where suffering can move into ritual and transformation. One of the clearest versions comes through tragedy, especially the tradition linked to Sophocles' Trachiniae, where Heracles' pain becomes public and irreversible. Deianeira cannot undo what she has done. Heracles, seeing that his condition will not improve, gives instructions that treat the end of his mortal life as something to be managed with order rather than panic. He asks that a pyre be prepared. That detail is important. The pyre is practical, but it is also symbolic. It is the last fire for a body that cannot be healed, and it becomes the threshold between what Heracles has been and what he is about to become. In Greek practice, cremation was not the usual mark of divine transformation, but in myth, it could signal that a human life had reached its limit and that something beyond it was beginning. The tradition does not preserve a single fixed account of who prepares or carries out the pyre. In some versions, Heracles' son Hylas helps arrange it or honors his father's command. In others, the figure most closely tied to the scene is Philoctetes, who receives Heracles' bow and arrows in return for helping with the burning. That detail is most visible in later retellings and mythic summaries, and it mattered because it connected Heracles' death to another heroic line of Greek story. Philoctetes is not incidental. The gift of the bow turns a death scene into a transfer of power. Even at the end, Heracles remains part of the heroic world that follows him. It also helps explain why the bow and arrows stay so prominent in later legend. They are not only weapons, they are a legacy passed on when Heracles can no longer use them himself. The pyre is one of the central turning points in the myth. In some traditions, Heracles climbs onto it willingly. In others, the accounts stress the hesitation of those around him. That variation reflects a larger difference in emphasis. Some tellings present the moment as a voluntary acceptance of the only path left. Others focus on the extremity of the pain and the fact that no ordinary remedy remains. In either case, the fire is not only destruction, it is separation. Heracles has already been divided from the domestic life he tried to protect, and now he is divided from mortality itself. The scene is often understood as a deliberate close to the life of a figure tested in every direction, against beasts, monsters, kings, and finally, against a body made unlivable by poison. The most famous claim attached to this scene is that the mortal part of Heracles is consumed by the flames, while the divine part is received into Olympus. This idea became central to his later status in Greek and Roman tradition. Heracles is not treated simply as a dead hero with a tomb. He becomes a god, or at least a hero whose destiny crosses fully into divinity. That outcome is unusual, though not unique in Greek myth. It belongs to a small group of figures who undergo apotheosis, a movement from human suffering to divine honor. In Heracles' case, the transformation fits the scale of the whole story. His life has always been split between mortality and exceptional power, between human family and divine interference. The ending resolves that division by making him one of the immortals. Later tradition could honor him in two ways at once, as a hero of the earth and as a god admitted to the company of Zeus. Not every source explains the transition in the same way. Some traditions place more emphasis on Zeus's role in receiving his son. Others focus on the practical sequence, the building of the pyre, the burning, the gift of the bow, and what follows. Later mythographers often compress these events into a single arc, but the older material leaves room for uncertainty. That uncertainty is useful because it shows how the myth balances two ideas at once. Heracles can die, but he cannot be contained by death in the usual way. His end is both final and incomplete. In some tellings, the silence after the fire matters as much as the fire itself, because what remains is not a corpse that closes the story, but a figure whose meaning continues to expand. His descent from suffering into divine honor also reshaped how later Greeks understood heroism. Most heroes in myth are remembered for a death, a tomb, or a local cult. Heracles becomes something larger. He is still tied to places on earth, to shrines and sanctuaries, but the ending on Mount Oeta gives him a place among the gods as well. That is why the fire matters so much in the tradition. It does not simply end his pain, it completes the movement from human struggle to transfigured status. By the time the story reaches Heracles' death on Mount Oeta, the evidence is already mixed. The oldest poems that mention him do not give a full biography. Homer knows Heracles as a figure of immense strength, but the Iliad and Odyssey preserve only selected episodes. Hesiod adds other pieces, especially in the theogony and related traditions, where Heracles belongs within a divine family tree and a wider heroic world. Later tragedians, mythographers, and local cult traditions expanded the picture, each preserving different emphases. The complete story of Heracles is therefore not one fixed ancient account. It is a gathering of versions, some older, some later, some local, and they do not always fit together cleanly. The broad shape shared by many sources begins with his birth. Heracles is the son of Zeus and the mortal Alcmene. He is born into the house of Perseus, which gives him heroic lineage before he performs a single deed. At the same time, that parentage creates the central tension of the myth. Zeus's son is also a mortal child, subject to hunger, fatigue, exile, and death. Hera's hostility marks that tension from the start. In some traditions, she delays his birth. In others, she sends dangers against him, and in others, she works through his madness or through the impossible tasks set before him. Later writers often explain the name Heracles as connected to Hera's glory, but the tradition does not preserve one agreed origin. What matters is the recurring idea that his life unfolds under divine conflict. That pattern appears early. One of the best-known childhood stories is the Serpent episode, though the sources vary in emphasis. The infant Heracles strangles snakes sent by Hera, announcing his strength before he can speak or train. Some versions place the event in the cradle, others in the household more generally, but the point remains the same. He is recognized early as someone whose body exceeds normal limits. Ancient artists liked this scene because it is visually simple. A child defeating serpents already looks like a hero. The image also condenses the myth as a whole. Resistance comes first, and recognition follows. Heracles' education is another point where the tradition branches. The outline is stable enough. He is trained in the arts expected of an elite Greek youth: music, wrestling, archery, chariot driving, and the handling of force. But the individual teachers differ from source to source. Some traditions give him Linus as a music teacher and tell of a fatal outburst when Heracles cannot endure correction. Others name different instructors for different skills. What these accounts share is a picture of a boy who does not fit easily into civilized discipline. He can learn, but he learns with difficulty. His strength is already so great that it carries danger with it, and that danger is not only against enemies but against the social order of the household itself. A moral framework attached to Heracles is the choice between ease and hardship. This version is especially associated with the choice of Heracles, preserved most famously in later philosophical retelling rather than early epic. The core idea fits broader Greek thought about excellence. Heracles is said to face a fork in the road between comfort and virtue, and he chooses labor, discipline, and struggle. Whether treated as old myth or later moralized expansion, it captures how Greeks came to understand him. He is not merely strong, he becomes great through work that breaks other men. His fame depends on endurance, and later audiences could use that image as a model of effort made visible in action. Before the canonical labors, the tradition gives him smaller deeds that establish his public reputation. These stories are local in character and vary by region. Heracles clears dangerous animals, confronts hostile kings, and protects communities from threats large enough to require heroic intervention. Some tales are tied to Boeotia, some to Thebes, and others to places farther away that later claimed a share in his wandering career. That mobility matters. Heracles is not the hero of one city alone. He belongs to many Greek communities at once, and later cities attach their own dangers and rescues to his name. This is one reason his myth expanded so easily. A hero who can travel can also be adopted. The tragedy involving Megara belongs to that same movement from household honor into ruin. In the most familiar version, Heracles is married to Megara and has children by her, though the number varies. Hera then sends madness, and in that madness he kills the family he should have protected. Euripides' Heracles is the best-known literary treatment of the catastrophe, but the event also appears in other forms across the tradition. The details differ, yet the consequence remains fixed. The hero who can master external monsters cannot master the destruction that enters his own house. His strength is unmatched, but it does not spare him from guilt. That is why this episode mattered so strongly to later tragedy. It turned the greatest of heroes into a figure who needed purification, not applause. From there, the story moves into purification. Heracles seeks cleansing after the killing, and Apollo at Delphi directs him towards service under Eurystheus. The oracle is crucial because it turns private wrongdoing into a public and ritualized course of action. Some accounts stress that Heracles goes willingly in search of purification. Others make the road harsher and more imposed, but the logic is consistent. He must endure a series of labors as part of his restoration. The tasks are punishment, compensation, and proof at once. They also explain why his story can be told as both suffering and achievement. The same deeds that mark him as cursed can also mark him as uniquely capable. The list of labors itself shows that the myth was never fully fixed. Ancient writers do not always count the same deeds in the same way. The familiar 12 is the standard later number, but some tasks are combined, some added, and some shifted in order. Vase paintings, epic fragments, tragedy, and mythographic summaries all preserve pieces of the sequence, but not always identically. The labors should therefore be understood less as a rigid checklist than as a traditional cycle of deeds attached to Heracles' service. The Nemean lion is usually first because it establishes the pattern. The beast cannot be pierced by ordinary weapons, so Heracles must rely on strength, wrestling, and close combat. The skin becomes his emblem afterward, making the victory visible in later art and literature. The Hydra follows with a different lesson. Force alone is not enough when the monster multiplies its heads, and Iolaus's assistance becomes part of the tradition in many versions. Some sources treat the aid as decisive, others make Eurystheus discount the labor because of it. Either way, the story shows a hero whose power is greatest when joined to intelligence and help. Other labors use different contrasts. The Ceryneian hind is sacred and swift, so the work is less about killing than about restraint and patient pursuit. The Erymanthian boar is a more direct test of endurance and control. The Augean stables shift the emphasis again. Here, Heracles does not simply overpower a beast. He solves a filthy, almost administrative problem by rerouting rivers through the stables. Ancient audiences clearly valued this kind of ingenuity because it turns labor into humiliation for a wealthy king and a practical lesson in force used intelligently. The Stymphalian birds, the Amazonian belt, and the journey to the far west each add their own register of danger, diplomacy, and boundary crossing. In some stories, Heracles receives help from gods or local rulers. In others, he acts alone. The pattern remains the same. He keeps moving into places where ordinary human order breaks down, and the stories keep asking how much can be solved by strength alone. That is why the later sources matter so much. Apollodorus, Diodorus, the tragedians, and scattered scholia often preserve versions more detailed than the older epic references, but they are also more systematized. They want a sequence. They want the deeds numbered. Yet even they preserve disagreements about what belongs in the core set and what belongs on the margins. The death of Heracles is one of the clearest examples. Some traditions emphasize the poisoned garment sent through Deianeira and the suffering that follows. Others focus more on the Pyre and the Apotheosis. Some local cults keep his hero cult on Earth, while literary versions raise him to Olympus. The same tension appears throughout the myth. Heracles is both a man of places and a figure who escapes fixed enclosure. He can be tied to a sanctuary, a mountain, or a city and still remain larger than all of them. That layered quality is what makes him endure in Greek tradition. He appears in Homer, but only in fragments. He is given ancestry and divine conflict in Hesiodic material. He is reworked by tragedy into a figure of domestic catastrophe. Later mythographers organize him into a sequence of labors and adventures. Artists on pottery select single scenes that can stand for the whole. None of these sources gives the entire Heracles by itself, and that is the point. The myth is not a single straight road. It is a set of roads that cross and rejoin, with some paths leading to the famous deeds and others to local variants that never became universal. In the historical record, that is exactly what a major heroic tradition should look like. It lives in fragments because different communities kept different parts of it alive. Seen that way, the contradictions are part of the tradition rather than a flaw in it. Heracles can have one mother in every version and still be claimed by several cities. What Heracles came to mean in Greek life cannot be separated from the places where people honored him. In cult, he was not only the hero of the labors and the figure of tragedy, he was also someone communities could invoke for protection, strength, and safe passage through danger. The myths gave him a biography, but worship gave him a continuing presence. Heracles was unusual even among Greek heroes because he stood close to the boundary between mortal hero and god. In some local traditions, he received sacrifices as a hero, with offerings made at ground level rather than on the high altar used for Olympian gods. In others, he was honored more like a god, especially where his apotheosis was emphasized. That distinction mattered in Greek religion. Heroes were tied to tombs, local memory, and the power of the dead. Gods were approached as immortal powers with wider reach. Heracles could belong to both categories, depending on place and practice. That double status helps explain why his cult spread so widely. A figure who had died, suffered, and then been taken up among the gods could speak to many different kinds of worship. Several cities claimed him strongly. Thebes had a natural claim because many traditions set his early life there. Argos and Tiryns were important because of their link to the house of Perseus, Eurystheus, and the labor cycle. Sparta knew Heracles as a model of endurance and hard discipline. Elsewhere, he was connected with gymnasia, military training, and the testing of young men, because his body had become a standard of human capacity pushed beyond ordinary limits. That did not mean every city worshipped him the same way. It means his name could be adapted to local needs. A hero who crossed boundaries in myth could cross them again in cult. In some places, his shrines stood near roads or gates, which suited a figure associated with passage and protection. In others, he appears in contexts tied to civic identity, where honoring him also meant honoring a local claim to ancestry or prestige. The symbols associated with him are remarkably stable. The lion skin is the most recognizable. It refers back to the Nemean lion, but in later art, it becomes a general sign that identifies Heracles at once. The club serves a similar purpose. It is not just a weapon from one episode, it becomes an emblem of rough, direct force under control. The bow appears as well, especially in scenes that stress distance, hunting, or mastery over dangerous space. In vase painting and sculpture, these objects often matter more than a full narrative. A single lion skin, club, or bow could identify Heracles immediately, which helped his image spread across the ancient world. These attributes also made him easy to recognize across changing artistic styles, from early archaic pottery to later Hellenistic and Roman works. Greek art used him constantly. On vases, he appears wrestling monsters, carrying off animals, confronting Amazons, or standing with Athena and other gods. Artists did not always try to tell the whole story. They chose scenes that were visually clear and familiar to the audience. A labor could stand for the whole career. A beast brought under control could summarize the larger theme of order imposed on wildness. Even when details varied, the core idea remained consistent. Heracles meets what is difficult, dangerous, or overwhelming and brings it back under human control. That same pattern also helped later viewers read him as a figure of human effort itself, not only as a monster slayer. The scene mattered because it could be understood at a glance, but it also carried a larger argument about what excellence looks like when it is tested. That image also carried moral and political value. Rulers and dynasties liked to connect themselves with Heracles because he embodied legitimacy through strength, ancestry, and achievement. In the Greek world, several royal houses and later city leaders claimed descent from Heracles or used Heraclean imagery to support authority. The Heraclidae, the supposed descendants of Heracles, became especially important in later Greek tradition, where their return was tied to claims over the Peloponnese. Whether those genealogies reflected historical descent is another matter. What matters is that the myth could be used to explain land, succession, and rule. A hero with a divine father and a human mother was an adaptable ancestor for families who wanted both prestige and heroic distance. In that way, Heracles became more than a character in epic. He became a language for inheritance and for the claim that rule could be justified by memory as well as force. The Roman world adopted him early and thoroughly. There he became Hercules, and Latin tradition reshaped him to fit Roman values and storytelling habits. Roman authors kept many of the Greek labors, but they also emphasized different qualities: discipline, labor, conquest, and service to order. Hercules could appear as a protector of commerce, a guardian of roads, and a figure of practical strength. In Rome, he was not only a mythic strongman, he was a useful divine presence at thresholds, markets, and places of exchange. The cult at the Ara Maxima in the Forum Boarium shows how deeply he entered Roman civic life, though its details also reflect a long blend of Greek and Italian tradition. His Roman form did not erase the Greek one. Instead, it added new settings and new uses, so that the same hero could be understood as a guardian of merchants, a helper in travel, and a symbol of labor that benefits the city. Later literature expanded his meaning still further. Tragedy had already shown that strength could not protect him from suffering. Hellenistic and Roman writers then played with the contrast between the violent hero and the burden of human weakness. Philosophers could turn him into a model of endurance. Moralists could use him as an example of choosing effort over ease, a theme linked in later summary to the choice of Heracles, sometimes attributed to Prodicus. There is also a long tradition of Heracles at the crossroads, where he chooses between an easy road and a hard one. That version survives indirectly, but it became one of the most enduring ways to read his character. The hero is great not because life is easy for him, but because he keeps moving through difficulty. That made him useful far beyond mythology. He could stand for the disciplined life of the athlete, the citizen, or the ruler who accepts hardship as the price of achievement. This is also why his image survives so well in later European art and literature. Heracles can mean brute force, but that is only the beginning. He can stand for labor, suffering, purification, survival, and reward after ordeal. He can be made into a divine son who points inward toward moral choice or outward toward public victory. He can be used by rulers, athletes, poets, and city cults because his story holds violence and discipline at the same time. Few mythic figures are that flexible without losing their shape. His symbols remained recognizable even when his meanings shifted, which is one reason he could be revived again and again in new settings without needing to be reinvented from nothing. The surviving evidence makes that flexibility visible. Homer knows Heracles as a great but troubling figure. Hesiod gives him divine parentage and a place in the larger family of gods and heroes. Tragedy turns him toward pain and disorder. Vase painters isolate one deed at a time. Local cults preserve regional versions of his presence. Roman writers transform him into Hercules. None of those layers replaces the others. They accumulate. That is why Heracles remains one of the clearest symbols in the ancient world. Not because his story is simple, but because it keeps adapting to what communities needed to say about strength, endurance, and the price of greatness. His legacy is not just literary, it is religious, political, and artistic, carried forward through worship as much as through story. In the end, Heracles is not remembered because his life was easy to follow. He is remembered because the story never separates power from suffering. The laboring hero, the man driven by guilt, the winner of monstrous contests, and the figure taken beyond ordinary death all belong to the same tradition. Greek myth keeps those pieces together instead of choosing one. That is why his image lasted. The lion skin, the club, the burden of labor, and the movement toward divine status all point to the same idea. Strength is tested by pain, and endurance can outlast defeat. Heracles endures because his story joins victory with loss, human struggle with transformation. He remains one of mythology's clearest images of perseverance.